Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. We're very excited to have Sandrine speak to us about the new Earth4All report to the global Rome. The title of the event is From Limits to Growth to an Earth4All, the 5 turnarounds needed for an economic transformation in North America and the world, for that matter, to achieve well-being within planetary boundaries for all. This event has been co-sponsored by the Ecological Economics for All initiative, Earth4All, the Meadows project, Rethinking Economics UVM, Rethinking Economics USA, the Gunn Institute for Environment, the US Society for Ecological Economics, and the Leadership for the Ecozoic. I'm Rigo Melgar. I'm a PhD candidate here at the University of Vermont, also part of the Leadership for the Ecozoic project between McGill University in Canada and the United States here at UVM. And I will let Lizah introduce herself.
Thanks, Rigo. I'm Lizah Makombore. I'm PhD student at the University of Vermont. I'm a fellow, just like Rigo, with the Leadership for the Ecozoic and the Gunn Institute for the Environment. I'm also here sort of wearing many hats. I'm also the student representative, sitting on the board of the International Society of Ecological Economics. I'm also current VP for Rethinking Economics UVM, so just a host of other representations. And I'm very excited to be here, excited to be hosting Sandrine, but I'll hand over to Rigo again.
Okay, so Sandrine, can you enable your camera now?
Let's see if it works. Hold on. And apologies for being late. I got kicked out of my space. There
she
is.
Hi,
everyone. Well, I'm so sorry. I was trying to find a quiet space to talk to all of you as I got kicked out of my room and told I had to move everything out in 5 minutes.
Oh, well, you're fine. We're just starting now. And well, that is Sandrine, and we're going to introduce her right before her talk. But before we do that, we will, here we go. Continue. So last year, this is the continuation of last year. We had a Limits to Growth event, and we're trying to do this every year for Earth Day. So we're very happy to be doing the continuation, if you will, of Limits to Growth. And just quickly, for those who might not be familiar, I'm sure very few of you aren't, Limits to Growth 50 years ago had 3 main conclusions. The growth trends will lead to physical limits, resulting in sudden and uncontrollable collapse, but that it is possible to alter these growth trends and to establish ecological and economic stability to have sustainability into the future, and that humanity needed to work on number 2 as soon as possible. So now we are kind of like getting in the crunch time, if you will, of doing that. And what is the role of ecological economics for all in all of this? Well, you know, it helps to inform all these different economic transformation initiatives out there that are trying to basically achieve an Earth4All. And one quote that really inspires us here at Ecological Economics for All is this one from Daniela Meadows that she actually wrote in 1993, 30 years ago. And she said, "The scarcest resource is not oil, metals, clean air, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other, and to seek the truth rather than seek to be right. Because we have not done that, another resource has become critically scarce: time." So there you go. I'm going to stop sharing this presentation, and then I'm going to show you video. Okay, there you go. You should be able to see it now.
Club of Rome is a group of scientists, humanists, educators,
it's irritating that humanity has not listened to us, but they haven't.
The warning bells were there already 50 years ago. The big difference is that now we truly are in the midst of the crises.
We are much, much closer to potentially catastrophic outcomes.
Now we have a short opportunity where everything is up in the air.
We thought it was the time to now reassess to see what does science tell us today and how does the future look like the next 50 years.
We have to change the story. We have to provide a plausible, coherent, consistent, and also science-based and numbers-backed story that people find more attractive than business as usual. We have one scenario called too little, too late, and then the other one is where we succeed in putting all those possibilities together.
We are proposing 5 turnarounds paid for by the 10% richest people in the world.
If we put in place the 5 turnarounds that we talk about, the focusing on inequality, the focus on poverty, the focus on empowerment, and then food and energy as the 2 key resources that will keep us alive as we're faced with some of these ongoing crises, then we actually could get ourselves out of this mess.
And the interesting thing with these 5 turnarounds is that they can be scaled from communities to cities to sectors, nations, regions, and then globally. So that's what we were looking for, like a fractal set of fractals that escalate or percolate down from the global economic system all the way down to specific communities.
We need to start with redressing, making sure that the solution is fair, is perceived as fair by a democratic majority. Unless we do so, we won't get a solution.
It's critical we talk about poverty because the poorest in societies are the most vulnerable and face the biggest risks, as we can see with the flooding in Pakistan, and we can see with the food crisis in sub-Saharan Africa. It's absolutely critical that we use this as an opportunity to spur sustainable economic development.
Currently, a large part of the world is materially, financially, economically insecure. And it is true when they're working, whether they're paid or unpaid, and it is true when they are not working. So a universal pension that guarantees affordable life is an essential part of this. So many women across the world, their lives are dominated by the unpaid work they do. If you want healthy, sustainable, viable societies, the importance of recognizing the contribution of women and the rights of women is absolutely essential. It is really about ensuring that societies are sustainable, that social reproduction occurs, and it's about ensuring that the rights of half the world's population are met adequately. Women must be given the freedom to make their own life choices.
In the food system, we would see a rapid change towards more logistics that reduce the unnecessary food waste and food loss so that we have food security.
I'm absolutely convinced that the Ukraine war will help us to accelerate the transition away from oil, coal, and natural gas.
So we could see an energy democracy where local sources, microgrids, local areas don't have to rely so much on the global fossil energy system.
What we're facing is not an environmental crisis. It's a crisis of security, of stability, of prosperity and equity. And that's what Earth4All really brings forward.
So the overall object of the latest report is basically to continue the fight.
If sufficient mobilization occurs, and if the demand for major changes in economic strategy gets loud enough, then we can actually achieve a major turnaround.
I'm fairly optimistic that we are going to see a very, very rapid transformation. But the question is, will it be fast enough?
Now we need to come together and we need to share this image that a giant leap is fully possible.
That comes back to a series of different structural shifts that we will have to make across the globe in order to ensure that we have truly an Earth for all.
So there we go. That was an excellent video, and I encourage people to share with everyone they can. Is the commercials after. So without further ado, Lizah, please introduce Sandrine to our North American networks. Microphone.
Lizah, you're on mute.
I think me and Rigo were trying to practice so much that these tech issues are manifesting. But thank you, Rigo, and it's my greatest pleasure and honor to introduce Sandrine Dixon-Declève. She's an international and European climate, energy, sustainable development, sustainable finance, complex systems thought leader. She is currently the co-president of the Club of Rome and divides her time between lecturing, facilitating difficult conversations, and advisory work. She currently chairs the European Commission Expert Group on Economic and Societal Impact of Research and Innovation, also known as ESIR, and sits on several boards and advisory boards, including Climate KIC, Lauder's Foundation, Imperial College, Leonardo Center, EDP, BMW, UCB, and is a senior associate and faculty member of the Cambridge Institute of Sustainability Leadership, CISL. In addition, she's an ambassador for the Energy Transition Commission and the Wellbeing Alliance, and a fellow of the World Academy of Science and Art. And in 2017, Sandrine co-founded the Women Enablers Change Agent Network. So I was saying to Rigo earlier on that I am super excited to introduce you, Sandrine, today. I see a lot of intersections with some of the work you have done, and perhaps my passions and, you know, what drives me to join, this movement. And the 5 turnaround principles so much resonate. And I'll just pick 2 things that I've seen in your very long and accomplished bio, being you are co-leader, I'm not sure of the right term, with Mampela Rampela, who was actually Vice Chancellor for the University of Cape Town, and I'm an alumni of
nice.
of University of Cape Town. And also I see you've worked with We Mean Business, and I've also worked with the NBI, the National Business Initiative, an NGO in South Africa. So really excited and great to hear from you and have a dialogue with you today. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm sorry, it seems like today is a bit of the not only technical issues, but also just access issues with what's happened with my my room here in Berlin. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. And I must say, I'm moving from a whole conversation around the geopolitics of Ukraine and China and the intensity of the complexity of the world that we're living in. And every time I move through those conversations, which are incredibly deep, we heard from a human rights lawyer this morning, the absolute atrocities that are happening in Ukraine. And yet we also heard about the realpolitik of what's coming out of China and the rapprochement between China and Russia. And so within all of that, we often, all of us who are looking for greater well-being and new economic models, in particular, as we take into consideration the great wisdom of Dana Meadows, that many of us have been very much educated through, we have to take a step back and realize that the complexity of the short-term levers and the short-term issues that we're seeing are very important to unpack and to understand within a long-term context of how we shift the long-term systems. And so maybe I'll turn now to what Earth4All has tried to offer, which is really a continuation of all the incredible work that the members of the Club of Rome, as we really do stand on giants, as well as the Club of Rome itself, through all of its many publications, was trying to not only celebrate, but commemorate as we went through our 50th anniversary celebrations of the limits to growth. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. So Rigo, I don't know if you've enabled that to happen, and move into the presentation. Tell me if this works, and see if I can get it obviously in a regular, hold on, slideshow mode. There we go. Does that work? Okay, one success. Wonderful. Good. What we've tried to do here, and by the way, this is a new conversation that we're really having on how we can integrate some of the Earth4All thinking within a North American context. So I will lead you through, obviously, the narrative building and where Earth4All comes from, and some of the results and the scenario development, and then bring in a new lens that we're developing through our system dynamic model around how this is resonating and should be resonating in North America, in particular based on some of the graphs and the interrelationships we're seeing between inequality, energy, food, and the turnarounds that I will talk about. The first, I think, key point that we really struggle with today, and that our system dynamic modeling is really trying to address, is clearly the juxtaposition of the social, economic, global commons, and political systems, and the complexities of all these systems at the same time. As we look, obviously, at the great tipping points of this time, through not only the pandemic, but also climate change and the conflict in Ukraine and other conflicts across Africa, Asia, Latin America, other parts of the world, the conflict between the US and China, we very much need to take into consideration the interrelationship between the social system and the need to address inequality, the need to also think through what population shifts are going to have in terms of impacts, whether it is a growth in population in certain regions and a decrease in population and an aging population in other regions. And the very important sense making also by media, understanding what the disruptions are, what is social media actually doing to our sense of what is right and wrong, as well as what we should have or should not have. And then, of course, the growing economic insecurity that we're seeing across the globe. And then that links obviously to the economic system itself and to mass unemployment or even the great resignation. What does that actually mean within the economic system? And to the endemic economic inequality that we're seeing, and the short-termism and the trade wars. And clearly, for all of us who have been very much working along the lines of, as I said, the great work of Dana, but ecological economists, the fact to address the shift from an extractive economy to a well-being economy and a more just economy. And then what within that context does that mean for the global commons? How do we take into consideration the great disruptions that we're seeing within the global commons, the use of natural resources, the need to address demand, the need to address actually impacts from the continued depletion of our natural resources and our great footprint, and then the juxtaposition of all of that with a political system that is continuously now under stress. Our notion of democracy, polarization and distrust, nationalism, the pullback in international cooperation, migration issues. And I said today in the session to women from across the globe, we all could be refugees. Let us not forget that. It is not just about certain regions across the globe. It will be also within our own countries, moving from north to south, or from south to north, sorry, but also between regions and between countries. And then, of course, the short-term political cycles. So we know that the key issue is the dominant extractive model that we have today. That neoliberal economic model is destabilizing societies and the planet, and that it's time for a change. And so this is truly the decisive decade for humanity. And I know that Dana is just yelling where she is right now, seeding all these beautiful flowers and thinking, what the hell took us so long to get to this being the decisive decade? Because we already knew in 1972 that that was the decisive decade. Now, instead, we have to deal with chaos. Now, instead, we need to think through what that actually means in terms of shifting everything at the same time. And for some reason now, oh, there we go. Okay. My computer was blocked. For some reason, we didn't do it. But this is also the moment where we're starting to tap into the consciousness of people across the globe. The fact that our survey demonstrated that actually in G20 countries, 74% of the global population want more well-being economies. And in particular, the youth who are understanding that this is a time of great malaise and truly we need to move to something else. You have this slide clearly and you've just shown it, Rigo. But this is the basis for our thinking in Earth4All. The fact that we need transformational economics and we need to be agnostic at the end of the day of the exact model that we will apply, apart from the fact that we need to shift from beyond GDP, that we definitely need new indicators. The conversation right now in Europe, for example, is live around what type of indicators. And the fact of the matter is indicators will need to be tailored to the type of economic situations, the type of economies we're speaking about, the type of countries we're speaking about, but they all need to shift from an extractive GDP-based economy. We have to absolutely take into account social and environmental risk and financial and economic decision-making. We have to think about expanding our perspective of public goods and socialize the rewards of environmental and social commons, placing a value on the global and the social commons and ensuring that actually our national accounts reflect this. And then correcting the inequity between high and low income countries, but also within countries, taxation of the wealth, broader wealth distribution, and ensuring the role of women and the agency of women and girls. This is not just about more women on boards. It's not just about more women leaders, which absolutely we need, but we need to make sure that women and girls have access to education, that within their communities, they are respected as the decision-making leaders that they truly are. These are some of the shifts that we need to have. So how do we get there? So 50 years ago, obviously in the limits to growth, we warned that if growth trends continued, we would overshoot the Earth's capacity. What Earth4All was meant to do is taking the 21st century context that we're in, taking into consideration this new contextual piece of the polycrisis, that this is really the time to change course, building on the, again, incredible thought leadership of all of those ecological economists and new economists that have very much guided us towards moving beyond GDP, and that we can steer humanity away from social and ecological collapse. That this is actually absolutely necessary. Okay, now why is this not working? There we go. And this is why we put together the models, thinking through the system dynamic modeling that actually, again, led to the incredible scenario development of the limits to growth and the potential for alternative futures. Thinking through how we can look at different policies and how they can affect human well-being, societies, and ecosystems in the short and long term. All of you who have studied the work of the limits to growth and the system dynamic modeling know what this is all about. But I think what's very important is the way then we took that system dynamic modeling and we stress tested it with a group of thought leaders called our Transformational Economics Commission. Part of our reflection coming out of 50 years of the limits to growth was that clearly we did not mainstream the thinking of the limits. How could we do that? How could we get out of just having siloed conversations amongst ourselves as economists, as scientists, as concerned citizens, and bring this to a broader audience, really bring more people on the journey? So what we wanted to do was first ensure that we stress tested the modeling with actual thought leaders from across the globe, not just from Western countries, because we do have most of our new economic thinking coming out of the West. And then building up on those results, continuing to have very important intellectual capital that is feeding into a discussion, a continuous discussion with citizens through citizen assemblies and the building of a movement. So we came up with 5 key turnarounds through that system dynamic modeling that was fundamental in order to get us to the giant leap scenario, which I will describe to you in a second. Those 5 key turnarounds are poverty, empowerment, inequality, food, and energy. And for each of these turnarounds, we have key recommendations. Because we're a little behind time, I'm not going to go into each of these recommendations because I want to first start to stress test this in a North American context. But you can see these recommendations, especially for all of us, they're not brain science. I mean, we haven't, apart from joining the dots, thinking through systemically, optimizing these 5 turnarounds. Many of the solutions are those that we've had and that we know we need to implement in order for us to truly get into a well-being economy. Part of this is, though, focusing on what I call the 2 key issues that really are going to drive social tipping points and actually going to create a much greater existential threat in the short term than environmental tipping points. So thinking through how we can actually, across all low and middle income countries, have a minimum income threshold of US dollars 15,000 per person per year, for example. Ensuring that at the international level, we shift towards a system that is allocating more to low-income countries for green jobs, creating investments through special drawing rights, starting to canceling and ensuring that we actually have as little debt as possible in low-income countries. And this is a conversation that is now live through what we call the Bridgetown Agenda, which has been very much led by Mia Motley of Barbados, and is getting a huge amount of traction in the IMF and also in the World Bank. And start to protect fledgling industries in low-income countries and promoting South-South trade. But in terms of inequality, and this is where it becomes important in the US, how can the wealthiest 10% take no more than 40% of national incomes? And that still sounds big, but for the moment, they're at 60 to 70%. How can we increase taxes on the 10 richest in society and make sure that actually we start to redistribute that wealth through the right types of governmental programs that are empowering people and creating less inequality? Legislate to strengthen workers' rights and introduce what we call citizen funds to give all citizens their fair share of the national income, which, by the way, is also being done in Alaska and Norway, 2 very different types of economies, but both realizing that you need to start to address the global commons and have an actual fee on the global commons that then is properly distributed. You can think about multinationals, especially extractive industries, that start to pay their fair due to citizens because citizens don't see the benefits. Neither, by the way, do most of the vulnerable countries where actually these extractive industries are purging and taking their natural resources. I'm going to jump these, if I may, because of the little amount of time, and instead go into then what are our 2 key scenarios. So one is the too little too late scenario. What if we continue on our current destructive path? And the other one is the giant leap scenario. What if we achieve the fastest economic transformation in history? If we look at the too little too late scenario, basically you can see that we continue to enable inequality. Poverty reaches 0 only around 2100. So in the meantime, social tension continues to rise. And then global average temperatures continue to rise as well, because we are continuing to have as much in terms of emissions, not only emissions from greenhouse gases, but also pollutants, which are making our lives practically inhospitable in terms of living on this planet. And what's very important here is that, again, this is today. It's business as usual. This is not 10 years ago. This is a too little, too late scenario where, for example, we continue to think about investing in renewables, but we continue to burn fossil energy. And that's a little bit where we are today. Whereas the giant leap scenario is poverty reaches 0 around 2050. which really then enables us to see well-being rise and temperatures stabilize, because we have both a green and a social deal that is being actually implemented globally, not just at the European level. And this is incredibly important. And if you look at the human footprint, for example, you can see that the greenhouse gas emissions go straight down, that the way in which we use fertilizers, if we're shifting from an industrial agricultural economy into a regenerative economy, that actually also goes straight down. So less nitrates, less pollutants. And we can also see that we have a growth in well-being, and GDP per person will grow as well, per person, not per few individuals. So that global social tension index that we've created, which for me is one of the most important results coming out of this work, is that through the well-being giant leap, we see a great increase. Whereas if you look at the social tension in terms of the too little, too late scenario and the well-being, we see that social tension continues to drive tipping points and social tipping points, whereas well-being goes straight down. And that differentiator between the well-being giant leap and the well-being too little, too late scenario is really what is going to create a hiatus in terms of a great influx of social tension points, which could actually lead to more wars and to more strife, which is the greatest existential risk that we are currently facing. Let me bring this in then into the US and look at North America. And again, this is predominantly focused on the US and not bringing in Canada, for example. So again, if you look at well-being in the US, we have seen that systematically with the extractive model that we have today, with the so-called American dream and neoliberal capitalism, that actually well-being has been systematically going down, and in particular in the 2020s is now very much dramatically going down. Whereas with the giant leap scenario, we see that actually well-being continues to go up in 2040 for the majority of the population. Now, what's interesting here is that we start to see a dip, and that dip is because as people get complacent, and we're hoping that that is not the case, but also, for example, if more people have access to food, we need to make sure that that food is healthy, that we don't then get into another cycle of well-being, meaning more about obesity, overeating, and not actually necessarily thinking through our consumption patterns, which are so fundamental. If you look at the average disposable income in the US, in the giant leap, that average disposable income goes up. In the too little, too late, it goes down. And what's interesting, again, is that we saw a peak in 2000, and we are in the midst of already disposable income coming down, where we see across the United States growing poverty, growing inequality, and also the other effects, which are growing suicide rates, growing mental illness, growing drug and alcohol abuse, etc. Emissions per person in the US, through the too little, too late scenario, we are seeing actually, not because of consumption patterns right now in terms of the shift, but predominantly because we are to a certain degree starting to have a slight impact of decoupling between our economic growth and the technologies that are enabling us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But in the too little, too late scenario, this just starts to balance out. Whereas in the giant leap scenario, we go way down. And that is because we start to look at the links between zero poverty, zero inequality, zero carbon, and zero biodiversity loss. And we shift from an extractive model into a well-being model that places a value on what is most important. And that is really important. Inequality in the US continues to increase through the too little, too late, as we saw before, and under the giant leap starts to radically go down, and then slowly will go up again, which is what we might be able to see in terms of the 2060s, etc., if we're not careful. And I think this is part of the refinement of the giant leap scenario that we need to do through the regional data, is to see really, if we stress test this, What does this mean across the US population? Do we start to see more populism? Do we start to see actually a backlash? Where we are seeing this in some of the well-being economies. So I think we need to be realistic. And this also gives us a need to really think through our strategy as we move forward. Cost of energy in the US will actually, in the too little too late scenario, continue to go up. Whereas in the giant leap scenario, if we're able to bring in proper energy efficiency and also bring in renewables and stabilize our markets, take out perversities, regenerate capital in very different way, then actually we see that under the giant leap, we can really reduce the cost of energy. And we have to think through that the cost of energy includes total cost, including externalities. So why is this important and why are we showing this? And I think this juxtaposition between social tension and also the level of inequality and poverty is fundamental. And what we've tried to do is address how social trust influences the political space available for transformative public action by thinking through that critical feedback loop of if we have growing inequality and we only focus on carbon abatement for the moment, or we only focus on shifts that are incremental in the food and energy sectors, then actually we will not move towards the giant leap scenario. And inequality will continue to drive social tension. And we know that if we don't enable access to food and energy now and in the long term, that as well will continue to drive social tension, as we're seeing it here in Berlin, where actually I've been blocked because there are people in the streets complaining that actually with the growth in energy poverty and food poverty and the shifts in pension plans, etc., everyone is feeling the pain. And so if we don't take that into account, and if we don't think about our narrative and of alternative future that actually enables them to have access to what they need, but also a higher quality of life, we will not, no matter what we do in terms of technology investments, actually be able to reduce inequality and ensure that we actually live within the planetary boundaries. So I'm going to quickly just lead you through these as an example of the thinking of how I have applied this, actually specifically in terms of recommendations that I give to the European Union. So this is a more European context, but I hope it will enable a conversation afterwards in terms of what then do we do when we're confronted with the short-term issues that we have today, and not be criticized for putting forward a pie in the sky, naive thinking of what our alternative futures can be. So the first is, when Ukraine invaded, I was called upon in my ambassadorial work for the Energy Transition Commission to bring in systems thinking in terms of how we could address the key stress points we were having on food, on the gas price, and on metals and mineral prices. And we basically, and I commissioned some thinking around world leaders have to tackle these consequences, especially the disruptions to food supplies, energy markets, and material supplies, which were also weakened by the pandemic, and by the way, will continue to be weakened by climate change now that we're going to suffer one of the greatest droughts we've ever had at the European level in southern Spain and France and Italy. We had to think through what's our resilience plan, rather than just knee-jerk reactions. That the resulting shortages and price hikes were impacting households and businesses globally, and the poorest were being the hardest hit. So we had to think about solidarity funds, and that responses to the immediate economic hardships of the war that don't take their systemic roots into account would risk slowing down and possibly reversing the crucial global advance towards a net zero, nature positive, and equitable world. This is an example of the systemic solutions that I brought forward with the team at the Energy Transition Commission. I'm not going to go into all of them, but I would like to give you the headlines. Protect the vulnerable populations against price spikes immediately. And we started to see that some of the member states were moving in this. Ensuring that we diversify supply chains and import markets so that we're not just dependent on certain resources, and start to think through local production for local consumption. Accelerate the substitution of increasingly costly imported products through regional and renewable resources. reduce the final demand for increasingly costly resources and products, and enhance resource productivity to get more out of constrained supply. Ensure that we optimize, ensure that we get through the 3 R's, make sure that we start to think through circularity, regenerative, but most importantly as well, keep the citizen in our sight. Make sure that we understand the needs of the citizen. So I'm going to finish with this. I truly believe that this is a unique moment in time. The global pandemic has forced us to reflect on what really matters, and we have to continuously tap into the subconsciousness of citizens and remind them when they say transformation is hard, that we had one of the greatest transformations we ever saw during COVID, even though we're back to business as usual. We can do it. The question is, how do we make it last? And how do we make it positive? The urgency is here. We have 6.5 years and counting to avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis. Juxtapose that with the poly crisis and the permanent crisis, we have to think through a planetary emergency plan. And 74% of people in G20 countries want to transform. So why don't we have leaders that are actually tapping into this? Why don't we have a leadership that is showing the way? Our responsibility, all of us, is to supply those leaders with the right arguments so they don't get caught with their pants down and or their trousers or their skirts up, as I say. So let's finish with our dear friend Donella, and let's not forget what she so clearly has said so many times and what I really try to convey at the end of all of my presentations. Yes, this is the decisive decade, and yes, it's pretty scary. But there are incredible opportunities. And as human beings, we can stand together. There clearly is too much bad news to justify complacency, but there's also too much good news to justify despair. So I leave it at that, and I'm open to have a few questions. I know that we're a bit late with all of the snafus that we had, but hopefully we can have a bit of a dialogue. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Sandrine, for, let me just share gallery here. So thank you so much for your energy and enthusiasm and your hope. You really bring hope to a lot of us. And I just have the greatest admiration for people like you who, amid all the negativity, amid all the attacks, amid everything, just keeps going and keeps spreading the word about what we need to do. And yes, we also believe this is a decade of action. That's why we're trying to educate as many economic students around the world in ecological economics so we can, bring about these transformational changes that we need. So just to start with, I know you guys are planning the Beyond Growth conference at the European Parliament next month, which is extremely important. And I just would like to have your thoughts on what you hope to accomplish and what's happening in Europe. And what we need to be doing here in DC too,
Yeah, thank you, Rigo. So the European Conference on Beyond Growth is being organized actually by a cross-party group of politicians in the European Parliament. And I think that's absolutely essential. It was led by Philippe Lambert's, a Green, but by the same token, he's brought with him this cross-party group of MEPs, which is, for me, the only way that we will move forward. So my hope is that we will be able to really translate some of the discussions that we have in the European Parliament into calls for action. What the Club of Rome and Earth4All will hope to do through that is we're already feeding in some of our thinking around indicators. This is right now on the table through DG Foresight, so the Director General in the European Commission, that is looking at foresight planning and looking at new indicators. The Joint Research Center is also putting forward new indicators. So taking that thinking and then bringing it forward in terms of a set of recommendations for real policy across the European Union is what I'm hopeful will come out of this. And this means that we have to be vigilant and also hold our leadership accountable for that to happen. So this is an incredible opportunity. We're feeding in all kinds of new thinking to that conference, including a paper that we just commissioned by Catherine Trebeck, who is also advising us and part of the We All family as well, who is starting to look at where the key tensions are. Because coming to one of the questions that I see in the question and answers is, how do we look at the groundswell of public movement? How do we bring in actually the kind of the bottom up rather than just the top down? And what we're seeing in our analysis in different countries that are starting to really shift in this direction is that you cannot succeed with just top down. You have to have the bottom up in a democracy. And clearly that's fundamental.
Yeah, thank you so much.
I'll sort of connect my question with one of the questions from the Q&A. It's from Jim. So Jim Stills, they say, I strongly believe in a globally consistent model for where we need to get to. However, I believe that we also need to embrace bottom-up option for implementation. This seems to escape the academic community. I've looked for it and not seen it. And just building from that, I am in awe of the giant leap scenario and some of the implications of that scenario in terms of, sort of the shift to move from the sustainable development goals, which I think only deal with how to raise poverty, maybe, and not really address the wealthy, right? Either in between or within nations, and sort of move to general resilience and also specific resilience and building that. And it seems to me that maybe the way we are self-organizing for the global commons and trying to integrate that with maybe citizen science and citizen education, knowledge, just addressing some of the issues that you spoke about earlier in terms of the dissonance as well. Like, we are so educated now, but we are not seeing, as citizens, we're not being able to self-organize together with our governments towards the resilience. So my question, maybe to extend on Jim's question, is the bottom-up implementation and maybe institutions. There seems to be a gap to me. So you have the North America talking about the Inflation Reduction Act, you have the Green Deal. In Europe, you have China, responding, trying to decarbonize the way they can and so on. So what are your thoughts in terms of the institutions for common, like a global commons, and also how does that relate to bottom-up approaches and implementation, and maybe relating it to the model where you are at now?
Yeah, thank you for that.
I hope I didn't ramble.
No.
So much that I wanted to ask you, but I think I'll stick to that.
Okay. No, excellent question. And the same in terms of Jim's question. So first, as I was saying, the whole idea of this, we have 3 pillars to this work. And the third pillar is movement building. And that movement building has to happen in terms of how do we both top down ensure that we get states to assume responsibility for leadership and make sure that they implement those 5 turnarounds to guarantee that people, citizens, thrive and don't just survive. That's their responsibility as leaders. Otherwise, they shouldn't be in their post. Full stop. In terms of the bottom up, we have to ensure that our democratic processes are working. Hence why we are calling for citizen assemblies. Hence why we are trying to bring more citizens into the conversation, bring them on the journey. We do that also not just through the citizen assemblies, but for example, our simulator, where people can actually engage with the data so it doesn't just become an intellectual exercise. We now are being asked to do a Netflix film. We have been asked to do several documentaries. We are also constantly out in the press. We just over the weekend in the 2 top Italian newspapers had an 8-page spread. We didn't ask for it, they asked for it. These are the ways to start to get out there. And this is not just to toot our own horn or tap ourselves on the shoulder. None of us really care about that. We just want to make sure we do this now at this time and we do it right. So yes, that bottom up is absolutely fundamental. We have to have more tools in the toolbox in order to bring citizens on board, but we also have to think through much more strategically how we actually impact international architecture, which does not function today, and enable countries to get out of trade deficits because of neocolonialism and imperialism that has created actually a model, an economic model that is extractive and that is continuing to be neocolonial, even if people are not feeling that it's countries that are in there, but it's multinationals that took over the neocolonialism. So the fact of the matter is, bring in then a universal basic dividend. Start to think through, how do you distribute the goods? How do you ensure that citizens feel that they're part of the economy? The over-financialized economy today gives shareholder value and profit motives in the short term the real big push instead of people. It does no longer reflect people, planet, and prosperity. And in that sense, you could fire thousands of people and actually shareholder value goes up. But the economy suffers from unemployment, from depression, from so many other aspects. We need to start making our leaders realize that that is not on. And that is why you have to have this groundswell and you need to have these bottom-up structures. Now, there are many other really good questions in here. One, which is also the difference between the perspective of Jürgen Randers, who is one of the authors of The Limits to Growth, and Ugo Bardi, who has been a member of the Club of Rome forever. And I think it reflects nicely, actually, in Dennis Meadows. If you talk to Dennis Meadows also thinks that he's given up. That we are in the midst of chaos, that we are collapsing. And you could say that the current social and environmental tipping points are a sign of collapse. They are starting to show. Icebergs are clearly melting and we can't rebuild icebergs. So yes, we are in the midst of, to a certain degree, a collapse scenario. Now, the question is, some will say collapse will happen in the next decade or in the next 2 decades, and for some it will. Let's be clear. Those that live on island states are going to have to leave those island states because they will be underwater. On the other hand, can we somehow step up to the plate and try to reverse, and we won't be able to reverse everything, through the giant leap in order to at least enable a quality of life where human beings can continue to live on this planet and not build that bullshit of going to another planet while we've just destroyed this one, by the way, because that's a total cop-out.
Yeah, I don't know if you got time for one more question. I love hearing from you, but if you do, let me know. If not,
I can take one more, even though they're ringing the doorbell to kick me out of this room again too.
Oh my God. Okay. So
that's my collapse scenario right now.
Well, I hope they don't. But so in regards to a question over there, when we talk about the Meadows' leverage points, right? There was the paradigm shift. That's the ultimate leverage that we try to accomplish for a systems change that is lasting. And they say basically that a lot of the turnarounds, policies are trying to get at the tip of the iceberg of that iceberg that has been used for systems change, but then there is all these other things that we don't see under it, right? The root causes. So when we talk about an economic transformation, how do we balance the fact that we need to do things now? We need to help people now because governments are going to become destabilized, and then how do we have a permanent, transformation that will be last and sustainable? Because that's ultimately, but that's very difficult, right? That's why I understand why you're focusing on those policies that we can hopefully get now in the next 10 years.
So the 5 turnarounds are not just about short-term levers. They're about the adoption of understanding the short-term levers now alongside long-term systems change. We can't, if we go out there and say right now, we're going to totally pull out of every single structure that we have today and build anew, then we will have chaos. So I do believe that we need to be smart and strategic Those short-term levers, though, are important if we don't want more stranded assets. If we want to ensure that we don't also have stranded governance making, because when I say stranded assets, it's not just technology, it's not just industry. I'm talking everything. I mean, stranded governments, stranded infrastructure, stranded architectures, because we are actually having to totally rethink the structures of tomorrow. But in the meantime, we have to create just transition plans. We have to make sure that we bring people on board. Otherwise, we will have absolute chaos, even much more than we have today. If there's another pandemic or another key war, then I really think we will be at the brink if we don't think through this right now and put in place some of the resilience factors that we have. That's why we talk about those 5 turnarounds. That's why we say, okay, tax the rich, tax 10%. We could actually do that. You know, just make the guys pay what they owe. We have to get stronger in terms of the perversities in the market today, in the economy, that are constraining us from moving forward. It's not 100% perfect, but it will start to create that real turnaround that we need in order to really build the future that we can build together. And maybe one last thought. What's incredible is that we've been having conversations with the Ukraine as well as with Singapore and different island states. With the Ukraine, the conversation is such that they're in the midst of a war. They have to totally rebuild. They want to use Earth4All as a guidance for rebuilding. In Singapore, they know that they actually have to rethink their value chain dependency. They don't have a lot of resources themselves. Totally different perspective. We all need to be smart enough. This is not a cookie cutter approach. This is thinking through pragmatically, what do countries need and people need to thrive, not just survive, and ensure that our economy and our financial system and our governments truly service people, planet, and prosperity. Isn't that a beautiful thing to hope for?
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
Yay.
and, you know, and ecological economists have been saying this for decades as well. And just to finish, you know, the fact that politicians can control the biophysical realities to a point, right? To a point that it can get out of control, and then society getting out of control. That's why I think it's so important that you guys are emphasizing the social tensions and then also the ecological foundation that we need to protect. So with that being said, I really appreciate your time.
Rigo,
I have to go and jump out of my room.
Yeah, thank you, Sandrine. But I also wanted to just recognize there were some questions. Maybe we can forward them to Sandrine. Sure. And when we send our email as a follow-up to this, we can address them. But there are some very good questions in the Q&A. But thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Be safe. Anyways, so that was a blast. Thank you all who joined us today. And thank you, Lizah, for co-hosting with me. It's always a pleasure. I don't know if, I know we said until 10, but we could probably just have a little discussion if people want to stick around or not, but it's really up to you, Lizah. What do you think?
I'm just so respectful of people's time. Yeah, so I think that'll be easy.
And we just appreciate everyone who tuned in, and we're gonna put the recording up on YouTube. So because I know it was too early for a lot of people, but we had to accommodate the time of Sandrine being in Germany. And this is the time that we could do it. And it was supposed to be an Earth Day event. So well, I hope everyone had a great weekend, great Earth weekend event. And just take care, I guess. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And if you want to learn more about ecological economics, go to Ecological Economics for All, and where we're actually coming up with curriculum in which we're trying to put together, bring in Earth4All, the turnarounds, and then how can ecological economics inform those. So stay tuned for that. Thank you so much. Take care.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
Bye.